Welcome to Nurture the Soul. I am your host today, Reverend Ellie Hutchison, and I am the Minister for Church and Community Engagement with the Faith Info team, and we are part of the Love of Church at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar that seeks to share practical and educational, innovative, and formational resources to engage with the critical topics of our time for all of our local churches and faith practitioners. We are always searching for ways to produce opportunities to engage with you, the beloved community, in order to focus on the care and education for the people of God. From cultural and community organizing to congregational leadership, from worship and theology to resourcing the small and rural churches, and from ministry with youth and families to a wide range of justice issues, we invite and feature guest artists, authors, thought partners, and key leaders. Nurture the Soul stays current to how the gospel is alive in our current time. We hope that this is a space of connection, community, and nurture for you. For together we can bring our church, our communities, and the world towards a place in which God imagines for all of us. So join us every Thursday at 3:30 Eastern Standard Time for Nurture the Soul. And from time to time, look for special offerings. And of course, you can always find out more about those offerings at our website at www.ucc.org/events, or visit any of our social media platforms. And friends, if these conversations move you, if what's offered here helps to enhance your ministry, your outreach, your organizing, and your soul, please consider donating to the United Church of Christ Annual Fund. And you can do that by texting UCC to the number 41444. It's your prayerful and financial support that helps programs like this, that is the essential work of the United Church of Christ. And as always, thank you for supporting us and thank you for being with us today. Back in 2022, my predecessor, Reverend Tracy Howell, was tasked with capacity building in our local churches with a goal towards community and cultural organizing and to help cultivate faith formation in our everyday lives of discipleship and worship. She realized that she couldn't and didn't want to do that work alone. And so she cultivated a fellowship to intensively train a handful of leaders and nurture the support necessary for sustained engagement in our complex and urgent issues facing the world. Through the leadership of these fellows, further programming and educational opportunities have become available regionally, according to the specific needs and the context of where these fellows find themselves. The Congregational and Community Engagement Fellowship was designed for authorized minister, lay leaders desiring to grow in the arts of community and cultural organizing, and to collaborate with the national setting to increase the capacity of local churches to build relationships and to organize across their communities on the issues that faced their community, and all for a transformative impact. This 2-year fellowship cycle was immersive and concluded with 5 participants that you have heard from and will continue to hear for the next few weeks. Part 3 of this 5-part series, it is my pleasure to introduce someone that I want to be like when I grow up, and that is the Rev. Jen Butler. Reverend Jennifer Butler is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and has been senior minister of Corvallis Congregational Church for 8 years. Her divinity work was completed at Portland Seminary with roots in the Quaker tradition. And while an adjunct professor at Portland Seminary, she studied and taught in the field of eco-theology and co-authored a book on the topic, Introducing Evangelical Eco-Theology. Jen is a fellow of Green Faith, Parker Palmer Center for Courage and Renewal, and this United Church of Christ grassroots organizing cohort. She sits on the board of Unity Shelter, otherwise known as US, and founded the transitional housing program called Safe Place that US currently operates. And since 2022, she has participated in Krista Tippett's On Being Social Healing Project and works nationally with the United Church of Christ's Just Peace Initiative. She explores faith and religious practices as revolutionary acts of courage and restoration in a chronically diseased world. Jen, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation around the growing realities of extreme poverty. And hopefully you can help introduce us to how your congregation decided to enter a journey of accompaniment rather than engage in typical transactional service models. And so first, I think we'd like to hear a little bit more about your congregation and how you are meeting the new needs of your community where you find yourself.
Thank you, Ellie. That was a sweet introduction. I was thinking a little bit about my congregation this morning and how to describe what Corvallis is, who we are, where we're located. So we're a really typical, in some ways, town and gown community. We have the Oregon State University in Corvallis, so we have that split between the college community and folks who are employed elsewhere or aren't students in the Corvallis community. We are a small town, really, if you don't count the college students. We're situated halfway between the Oregon coast and Portland. We're overwhelmingly white outside of the university demographic. And some other things that I think are really interesting about Corvallis is we are the second we're the second most educated city in the United States. So per capita, the amount of college and post-grad degrees we have ranks us really high. We are also the highest rent burdened city in the state of Oregon. So that means more than 40% of our population are paying more than 50% of their income toward housing. So that's a really interesting disparity, I think, between those two statistics. We are also overwhelmingly democratic. This is a very liberal, progressive community, but 10 miles in any direction of Corvallis, and you will encounter a community that votes very differently and holds very different political viewpoints. So while Corvallis is kind of the hub, like maybe the urban hub, a tiny urban hub, we have very small rural communities all around us whose residents are often coming to Corvallis to interact, whether that's buying groceries or attending a place of worship or seeking social services. So that's sort of a little taste of Corvallis, and I suspect that that's like a lot of the communities that the UCC finds itself in across the country. My congregation really looks just like that. It's overwhelmingly white, very well educated. Got a lot of PhDs and a lot of retired clergy people sitting in the pews. We're starting to venture a little younger than 60 and over, but still most of our congregation is 60 and over. And I would say that, like most congregations, in terms of how we've been interacting with the community, that's a story that has all kinds of different seasons. There was a season in the 60s where we were very politically and socially active. And then our justice commitments have waxed and waned and taken different shapes and forms. And I think did something that a lot of churches did in around the turn of the new century, where we started to draw very inward with a focus on taking care of our own and developing ministries that were more internally focused rather than externally focused. So I think that covers some territory there. Was there something you think I should circle back around to?
No, that is fantastic. I think that that's really important because as we're continuing to live into this UCC identity in a contemporary time, we notice that with all things, we change, right? And I like being able to geographically and culturally center the conversation about the work that it is that you find yourselves engaged in. And so thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
We have had a couple different conversations leading up to today, and that's why I said, just for the record, I'm older than you, so I still have a lot of growing up to do, but I still want to be you when I grow up. And
That's
in
sweet.
that, it's a little bit about the work that you were called to do um, as the church, and in particular, the ways in which you approached that work in looking for or exploring alternative ways to our carceral system. So can you talk a little bit about that? And then from there, we'll move into the theology.
Of course. So the way that we ended up engaging the work that we're doing around housing and folks living outside in extreme poverty was sometimes I tell this story as though it was an accident, and sometimes I tell it as though it was a divinely appointed meeting. And I think both are probably true in some way. So it was the summer of 2019 in Corvallis when we had gone through a staffing transition, a minister that we had on staff who was really had an eye focused on issues of justice, had partnered with some local activists in our church and done some volunteerism outside of the congregation with folks living outside, and had developed this relationship with people. The church, is situated in a really interesting space. Our property connects to 100 acres of property that is privately owned and had been planted with Christmas trees about 30 years ago now. Not a managed tree farm. This was done as a for tax purposes on that property. And so it sat there and these trees have grown and it hasn't been harvested or cared for. And as soon as those trees became large enough to provide shelter and some anonymity, some privacy, folks have been living in that tree farm. So we've been adjacent to this community of people living outdoors, and just in that story of the church's seasons of life at different points in time, we've been more or less connected. This particular minister, they developed this relationship with some folks who were living close to the church. We had a porta potty in the parking lot. We had a dumpster. We were trying to sort of engage in some really minimal level of human dignity and basic rights, basic needs provision, and harm reduction. Well, Amber left this congregation for another kind of work. And that summer of 2019, I found myself in a conversation in the parking lot with folks who were living on that tree farm space. And I didn't even really understand how many people were living out there or who they were. So we started this informal relationship, and they might come in to use the restroom in the building or attend a service every once in a while. And one Sunday, as I was getting ready to walk into the sanctuary, someone from outside came in and said, "Do you know that people are being arrested for sleeping on the church's front porch?" And I didn't. And I walked with this information. And, oh, he had recorded one of these arrests taking place on his cell phone. So he's showing me this video of someone sleeping peacefully on the front porch of the church and being forcibly, like not very gently, picked up by law enforcement. So I walked into the sanctuary that Sunday with this in mind. And maybe because I didn't know any better, I shared this with the congregation during prayers of the people and just put out into the community, like, how are we supposed to think about this? What do we do with this information? So that began this like really cartwheeling effect of finding out why people were being arrested for sleeping on our front porch and saying, wait up, like that's not something that we can get behind. And then one Sunday I drove into work, and because the law enforcement was sweeping that tree farm property, this the community living in the tree farm sort of started talking to one another, saying, let's get as close as we can to the church because we've been developing this relationship with the church, and let's ask them if they can provide shelter. So there were 30 plus tents on our property just overnight. And we as a congregation had to learn every step of the way. So what's the next right thing to do here? Do we agree with the criminalization of poverty, which was what was happening when those folks were being trespassed on our front porch without any standing agreement or desire from the congregation to do that? And so when those tents arrived on our property, we had yet another sort of carceral conversation to have because it was illegal in the city of Corvallis to pitch a tent as shelter. And so we had to decide then too, are we going to follow the rules as mandated? And are we going to just call for, law enforcement to remove what's happening? Or are we going to think about this in a different way? And we decided to think about it in a different way.
Yes, I love that. As my own personal advocacy is around those who are currently incarcerated inside prisons, I definitely hear and appreciate that. I wonder, before I get a little bit into I'm going to stay the course. I'm going to ask the question because you planted a seed about it pretty early in your response, is from a theological perspective, right? You said that there's this perhaps a God ordained, for lack of better term, event that happened as well as this just chance, and how they're kind of intertwined together. So from a theological perspective, how did you get folks on board to being in relationship with those who don't come to the church? Or perhaps even another way to think about it is that moving beyond this NIMBY attitude, which is the not in my backyard attitude.
That's such a good question. And I think that there are also seasons or stages of that, how that is unfolding. The context that we were in as a community that summer in 2019 is, again, curious. We were exploring some questions about what it meant to be a community of faith in this particular historical moment and in our particular community. And in the process of asking those questions, we were on a little exegetical journey of our own through the scriptures. And sort of our touchstone through that process, through that time of question asking, was John 1, 14 through 18, which is that passage about the word being made flesh. And for whatever reason, we weren't using the NRSV or the translation that I think would translate that as the word became flesh and dwelt among us. But we were using the Message, Eugene Peterson's translation, which I hardly ever use that in worship. But I liked it because the way that gets translated by Peterson is the word became flesh and showed up in the neighborhood. And that's the question that we had been asking as a congregation. Where is the word showing up today around us? And so we'd been sitting with that particular imagery. And curiously, we'd also been talking about, because some translations don't say dwelt among us, it says tabernacled among us. And if you think about the first tabernacles in the Exodus story, these were tents, right? Tents moving through the desert. And so we had this imagery that was moving and living among our imaginations of tents. And then the tents showed up, not just in our neighborhood, but on our front porch. And so we had to really turn to each other and say, like, oh, what do we do? What is the next right step when what we've been asking for and seeking in some sense has just become made manifest? So all summer long, and I still hear it from the congregation today, people say, well, it was so clear to us because what happened is Jesus showed up in a tent on our front porch right after we asked the question of what would we do if this happened. So at least initially, the theological imperative was so strong, there was no question in the congregation. It was just like, oh, we absolutely know what the next right step is. And we've tried to keep asking that, all the time. And after that, what is the next right step? So we've moved from that theology of initial, like, well, you certainly don't call the police when Jesus is asking for safe sleep, to, okay, then what does it mean to engage in a social service partnership that is rooted around solidarity instead of charity, or to create an environment that is not a transactional service provision, but a journey of person first and accompaniment and companionship. It turns out that also at every step of this journey, what is true for us inside the congregation, what we say about what it means to be human and how to show up for other humans in the world is exactly the same. We're holding those same touchstones inside and outside of the congregation. Well, it means to accompany, to be present, to be to acknowledge belovedness. So, like, theologically, then we went on this thing about companionship, and there's a rabbinical text from the 9th century that says every person is accompanied by angels, by a crowd of angels heralding them as they walk, announcing, this is the image of the Holy One. The image of the Holy One is approaching. And so we've tried to hold on to that inside of the sanctuary and cultivate it outside of the sanctuary, that every time we interact with someone who's living, that is what we're carrying. An image of the Holy One is approaching. NIMBY is complicated. It turns out that we are all NIMBY people in some way. And the way that we've addressed that, the way that we get to address that in the congregation looks a little different from how we address that with the broader community or our housed neighbors living across the street. That's been challenging at times, but yeah, the clarity of, like, the tent showed up in the neighborhood was so magical.
Yeah. I hear so many folks in UCC congregations and in and about the world, when spirituality or faith comes up, about it took me to go through this hardship. It took me to go through this or whatever. And I have said in my discernment process as a member in discernment at one point, I really needed, I never got to hear the voice of God or the Spirit come to me. It was always through other people. And I've ignored those calls a lot. And so for this tent to show up, for the scripture and a Bible scripture that you don't typically use, the translation you don't typically use for there to be there. Sometimes you just have to say, well, there it is, right? And so for it to be there, you mentioned in your questions or in your answers something about this idea of like the charity to solidarity kind of mindset. For folks that may not quite understand that from a faith perspective, can you talk a little bit more about what you mean about that? And before you do that, I want to invite all of those who are joining us live right now. Please feel free to type in any questions that you have at the end. We will be asking these questions to to Jen, although we have some folks on the back end that are going to be keeping an eye out for us. Make sure you put that into the Q&A feature. If you do put it in the chat, the name I just mentioned earlier will help to bring our attention to it. And if you are watching this post this event and you have questions, you can find my email information. We'll build connections from there. Back to Jen to talk a little bit more about that charity versus solidarity.
Actually think about this a little bit differently when I'm thinking about it from like a homiletical perspective. In the social service world, we sort of talk about person first language and a person first approach, meaning that that our intent is to really journey with a person, to be in solidarity with their goals, their life energy, their decisions, their autonomy, to really remember that we are working with human beings who are as fully embodied and precious as we are, no matter what sorts of choices they're making or not making, because often some of these choices are because there are no alternate choices available. And so charity is about, it has an inherent power differential between the provider and the person seeking services. Solidarity sort of levels the playing field with things like being low barrier and not requiring like none of us do this, I know, but there are some organizations that to provide a meal, you also have to come in to the prayer service, right? That's like a charity model we don't believe in. But um, I also think about solidarity versus charity in this purely economic. Um, oops, I forgot to mute my office phone. It's going to ring for a minute. An economic paradigm that then I think can be rolled out to others. So when we're thinking about like Jubilee laws and the year of Jubilee and Sabbath and what it means to give a tenth of the tithe back, that relationship between the divine and the earth and those who care for the earth was about giving the first fruit and the best of the first fruit. That's what you give away, right? And then there are years where that is taken and used explicitly to cancel debts. And there are years in every year that's taken and given to the poor, the vulnerable, the widows. That's not about the leftovers. It's not like, well, at the end of the year, I have to make some distributions from my tax, to like lower my overall wealth. And so I'm going to make some choices about how to allocate that. That's really charity. Solidarity is making those choices first above your own needs, your own desires, and saying, my first job as a human is to believe that I have an abundance and to give back, to give away, to give back out to the community, the best and the first fruits of that abundance. And so I also think a lot about that. So often, we're giving our like used old clothes to the overnight shelters. And I really try to think like, what does it look like to be in solidarity? That means that it's not about the leftovers. It's never about the leftovers. It's about you're holding that community or that individual first in your mind. And then what's enough, that's yours. Enough is yours, but the first and the best has never belonged to us. Oof, that was a bit of a tangent, I know, Ellie.
Yeah, no, that was a beautiful tangent, right? To think about what is the best is yours, and what is mine is the enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I know that I've had a number of conversations with faith communities across the state where I reside, and have participated in some webinars nationally about churches and faith communities wanting to engage in this work. And one of the common objections that I hear, beyond it's such a big problem, we don't know where to start, is this idea of what, because local policy tends to be very restrictive in regards to zoning and all of those, like you had said, you did not know that it was illegal for. And so thinking about that in regards to the rights of churches, whether it be from a legal or a political standpoint, Can you share with the larger community now, what did you discover in the process of accompanying our neighbors?
Mm-hmm. Um, so the most significant thing that we discovered was that in 2000, Congress passed a law. The shorthand for it, actually, this I will type into the chat. I think more people are aware of this now than maybe even 5 years ago. But Congress passed this law that says it federally protects the rights of religious institutions, and also this works with both prisons and religious properties. So it's the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. And what it does is it protects communities of faith. It prohibits land use regulations that would impose zoning, other ordinances on a religious exercise, right? Unless that regulation is the least burdensome way to impose legal structure. What that means is that, oh, thank you, Ellie. That's awesome chat work. What it means is that if what a community of faith is doing on its property is worship, then it is federally protected and cannot be subject to the same kinds of zoning and other ordinances that for-profit organizations would be subject to. What was very interesting about discovering that law was that it felt like a feat of massive, it was just to convince the county that housing was an act of worship, that this was inherently connected to what we were about and who we were as people of faith. That was fascinating. And the amount of other religious organizations and religious people in the community who could not connect the dots. Worship is about what you do inside your sanctuary on Sunday morning for 90 minutes. It is not about what you are trying to do on this piece of land that we, our land that we own. So that was very interesting. Ultimately, we didn't have to rely upon RLUIPA. Again, this was divine appointment. There's a land use attorney in our congregation who's been a member here for, 30 years, who was right next to us in the process and knew the law better than, the county and the city knew the law. So what we ended up choosing to do, because we could have moved through legal action, relied upon RLUIPA, and just said, we're not going to play your game at all. We don't have to, actually. What we decided to do was something else. We decided to move through a conditional use permit process that was very lengthy, very time consuming. But what it did was, it didn't say that the Congregational Church can do this on their property. It made it accessible to any religious institution, or in fact, non-religious institution, any piece of property in Benton County that wanted to house individuals in the way that we ended up choosing to house folks. It became accessible to everyone because we chose to go through this process, which we never would have done without this land use person being so committed and connected to us. But another thing that we found out during that process, and we were talking to, the best RLUIPA attorney in the United States about the cases that he had accompanied other congregations through that relied upon RLUIPA. What we learned is that hardly anyone at that time knew that that ministry worship is federally protected in this way, and that in fact probably your city and your county and local government doesn't really want you to know about that or be able to lean on that because it can create problems for them. So what I tell churches who call me sometimes and say, like, tell me how you went through this process. Like, yes, you can go through what we did and do the work to create something that's available to all people, but also you should have in your toolkit the knowledge that you are federally protected, and you do have, at the end of the day, yes, it might take a lot of money and a lot of time, but you won't lose this. It is part of what it's, and I think it's not just this legal thing, it's in our DNA. It's what it means to be a community of faith.
Yes, 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 yes. The state where I reside, where I used to live within the state, it was often the city blamed the county blamed the state went back to the county, it went back down to the city, and then it went to the neighborhoods, the historic neighborhoods in the community. And so it was just this, nothing, it was just a delay factor.
It's a hot potato. It's just like, let's all pass the hot potato and see who ends up with it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I heard so much in your answer in that work. And I think, what's important is, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but recognizing who in our community, whether it be within the building where sanctuary happens and or beyond our building, is this idea of who has the capacity and the knowledge and the skill set that we can tap, that we can cultivate that relationship with and move forward in a way that where all of us have a way to be entwined in this process. Mm-hmm. And I think too, very much about what you talked about is some of the pushback from the other churches and or faith communities in your community itself was like, well, this is where worship happens. But if you think about it from an Indigenous perspective, right? Yeah. And so there's a lot of intersectionality in the work that you have brought forth in your community. And I applaud that. Mm-hmm. In that, we are seeing cities, communities, rural communities across the nation are seeing such a growth in staggering inequality, unlike what many of us haven't quite lived through in the same way, right? We see this cycle coming out through our history. Our biblical stories talk about this kind of stuff as well. But for us alive right now, I wonder, and that are feeling the angst of our family, our loved ones, our church members, whatever it is, what is it that you see happening around inequality? And what is the call of our faith communities in this hot button time right now?
Yikes.
Easy,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. No. Well, I think you're right. For most of us alive today, I mean, we're losing that generation that lived through the Great Depression, right? So it is true that most of us have not seen the kind of economic downturn. I mean, there was 2008, but where we're headed and where statistically it looks like we're headed is something we haven't experienced in our lifetime. As you said, in 2023, homelessness increased, I think, by 12% in the United States, which was an enormous leap from the year before. And that number is based on something we call the pit count. It's a point in time count. We're on a single day in January. This is kind of wild, the federal government relies on volunteers all across the country to attempt to find the people who are living outdoors or who are using emergency shelter in their community to get a number. What we know, based on working in our own community, is that count is always an undercount. sometimes it's as much as half, it's as much as 50% of the reality of folks who are really living outdoors. So we know that this number keeps increasing. We know that pandemic was an incredibly difficult economic hit that people are not recovering from the way that we may have hoped that folks would recover from. If you look at the statistics around rent burden that I talked about earlier, all of these things are just sort of combining to create levels of poverty that we've never before experienced. And it's all over, right? It is coast to coast, and it is both the urban and the rural environment. There is no community that is not being affected by rising levels of poverty. At the same time, this failure of the system to truly provide affordable housing, to build enough housing, affordable enough, with enough support, holistic support involved for folks who really need it. I mean, this has been an issue since the 1870s in our country that became really catastrophic in the 80s when we began to defund programs and close institutions that provided things like mental health support, which weren't great or perfect institutions to begin with, but we didn't replace it with anything, right? So we just have, as you said earlier, these interconnected issues that are creating a real crisis. So I don't think this is getting better. I think it is getting worse. I think we see the real worst of that every time any of us go to a major city, major urban space, and see the numbers of tents and people just living outside. Sometimes people say, well, it's only happening in the cities. It's simply not true. Rural homelessness and poverty looks very different than it looks in urban spaces, but it is on the same trajectory. It's more hidden. It happens more in nature, or folks are, doubling, tripling up in houses, living in their cars. Car camping is an enormous thing happening all across the country. So what did you ask me? You asked, like, what is happening? It is getting worse. We cannot rely on someone to come and save us. We have some indications, right, that really actually the government is going to go in the opposite direction. This Supreme Court just heard a case around cities and the criminalization of homelessness, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the cities placing more bans on living outdoors. What will happen with the next election? Like, no one's coming to save us. Who is going to do the work? I think that's the question in front of the church, and really wrestling with a couple of things. I mean, I often hear people say this isn't the job of the church. This is the job of the government. I don't know that I agree with that. Even if I did, what happens if the government isn't doing anything? And secondly, how in the world do we exegete love your neighbor if not this?
Amen. I'm ready for church, Jen. I'm coming. Thank you.
Come down or up or over or whatever that means geographically.
Yeah. I often am yeah, there is that kind of like what I led into the question. There's the county that blames the state, that blames whatever. And oftentimes faith communities are left out of those communities that are impacted directly, and faith communities are left out of those conversations, right? These meetings happen during the day at some hidden building somewhere in the town square. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not invited to the table for the strategizing or the solution building, but we are asked to pick up the pieces consistently and then pointed back to, well, I don't know, why aren't the churches doing any of this?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I don't know about you, but I often get a pushback on the idea of, and I'm going to use air quotes for those of you who are just audibly listening, the organizing, I put that in my air quotes, right? So I get pushback on the idea of organizing, especially from many within the church. I know, and I have seen and heard a lot recently, especially from folks within that say the church is a community center, or it's a place for individual growth and nourishment, or something that they've always done. Like they just have always gone to church on this day at this time and prayed this way and served in this way. But there is a movement that is inviting us to think about church differently. And as our denomination states, God is still speaking. So, what did you see changing about your church in the process? And how can that be a message for others as we continue to grow into what it is that we're called to do?
I'm going to try to wander a bit through your question. And I just want to thank a huge thank you to Laura for I'm seeing all these amazing links that she's popping into the chat, and every one of them is super solid. So thank you, Laura. And I hope if this is an issue that interests people, that you'll explore some of those links. Organizing and the church. This is the way we've always done it, or this is my place for refuge, or away from. I often hear people say, this is my space, my sanctuary to get away from all the badness. It's in the news and my Facebook feed. And I hear that, and I think that's not something to be dismissed, because I do think there's a space for religious community as a sanctuary, as a place to remember ourselves. But there's this tether that runs throughout the entirety of our tradition that tethers us not just to God, but to the other. Like, we only thrive. Padre Gotuma has a beautiful piece of poetry that one of the lines is, in fact, I think one of his books is titled "In the Shelter." But there's a poem, right, that says that I exist in your shelter. And that to me sounds very biblical. It's this thread of at every step as the biblical ethos develops, it is about the tethering of my humanity to your humanity, which means I am not free to move in a way that takes away your ability, Ellie, to move well and wholly human in the world. And so if that's our tether, then there's nothing we can do as a faith community that is not tethered to the well-being of the other. And we are invited over and over again to consider the other not simply to be our friend or neighbor that we're really comfortable with, but the stranger and the foreigner. So that means quite literally that our well-being and our work as a community always has to be tethered to the most vulnerable parts of our community. And that's something that you can't argue with, because it shows up throughout the Hebrew scriptures and throughout the New Testament. In fact, I think it is the message of the gospel. I don't think Jesus was partisan, right? I don't think Jesus was interested in partisan politics either, but Jesus was inherently political. Every movement he made was about interacting with the polis. Politic comes from polis, the city, the community, the place where we all have to show up and be human together. And at every turn, what we see Jesus doing is community organizing. That's fundamentally what he's doing as he moves from Galilee to Jerusalem, gathering followers, gathering the community, saying something stinks in Denmark. What are we going to do about it? Because there's another way to be human. There's another way to live together. We're even community organizing in the Hebrew scriptures too. I mean, what are the Israelites doing? They are community organizing to escape the hand of Egypt, right? And build a new way of being human and in relationship to each other in the wilderness. And I think that churches, so maybe we need to like remember our own history and remember where we came from as people of faith and sort of some of our touchstones. So like if you don't have this, then maybe you're doing it wrong. Maybe you're really misaligned with who it is and how we're supposed to be in the world. But I also think that churches know how to community organize. It's like in our bones. I know, and everyone in my congregation knows who to call for the best chicken soup for the potluck. That's community organizing. That's asset mapping, right? It's asset mapping and saying like, who can do this specific thing? I need them to show up in the table because I have to do this. I have to feed 50 people on a Sunday. How am I going to get it done? We absolutely know how to community organize, and we actually don't have to take a lot of classes to learn how to do it, because for so many of us, it's so fundamental to how we learned to be in community and grow up in a congregation. So I would say if you think you're not organizing or it's not the job of the church, you probably already are. You just don't think of it in that way. And if your thought process is that you shouldn't, then I think you got to read your Bible again. You got to take out your text and remember your own history and your roots, and then really ask yourself some questions like, am I in this? Do I get to call myself a follower of Christ? Can I call myself a follower of Jesus? If what I'm doing is opting out of the way, maybe that's not the game we're in, actually. And maybe you should actually go to, I don't know, Rotary or yoga on Sunday morning. Maybe that would be better. That was a little sassy, sorry.
Yeah, I love sass. I'll take it. It reminds me of a Ted Lasso skit, but yes. I have one question, and we have a question into chat. I invite all of the participants to share any questions that you might have. Know that you can reach out to me as well personally for there to be other connections. But one final question before we turn it over to the audience is, what have been the impacts of your own community you serve and of your congregation itself? What is maybe one or two things that you can share with us that you've noticed?
I think we have really expanded our understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to be tethered to each other. I think that's just been a fundamental shift that we continue to be making as a congregation. Also, I told you this, Ellie, this is a part of the story that I don't always like to talk about, because I get really, really weary of churches talking about needing to come back from their decline or adding numbers to the pews or, developing another marketing strategy so that people will know they exist. I just don't think that that's our job at all in any kind of way. But the reality is that as we have engaged in this work, our congregation has expanded, both who's showing up on Sunday in the sanctuary, who's joining us online, and who just now across the community, we've pitched our own tent in the realm of public theology, and we're now looked at by individuals, by other communities when something occurs, whether it's around poverty or something else, to say, well, what is the Congregational Church thinking about this? What are they doing? That's been an exciting space to be able to occupy, and also a pretty heavy reality. Like there's a lot of weight and power that goes with that. So we have grown, which I think is an interesting byproduct, but it wasn't part of our intent. And maybe that won't be happening next year. More than anything else, it's been interesting to engage this entirely new part of Corvallis and our surrounding communities who would never have thought about re-entering a church or having anything to do with a religious community, who consistently say to us, well, I've never encountered a church that I thought was actually doing any good at being a church. But you guys are doing something outside of your sanctuary, outside of Sunday mornings, that seems like, well, that's what a church should be about. So I've enjoyed it. I mean, in a very, we also have an incredibly high number of atheists in Corvallis. That's sort of also on our national statistics. So it's been interesting to get to maybe help people reimagine what it might look like to be the church and to be a part of a faith community.
Yes, I love that. That we have that on our banners, right? Be the church.
That's true.
It's
Yeah.
an action statement. We have two questions that came in from our participants today, but I want to tie that into a reflection of the ways in which you engaged with the work that you do, with the way that you engaged our dialogue today. Is you use a lot of embodied language, right? Of how we live into our bodies, what we are called to be, how we are connected. The last word that you used that stuck out for me was tethered, right? How we are all, it's like the umbilical cord, right? How we are all providing nutrients to our bodies back and forth. And so these questions are, was there ever really low or disappointing time for you? And really, how is it that you find yourself, and not really, and how do you find the time, and what do you do to care for yourself and the community that struggles to survive capitalism, in addition to all of the radical work that you're doing? So when was there a low time, if there ever was any? And then how do you deal with that from an embodied perspective?
Yeah, the low time I would say was, there's so much adrenaline and energy running through the first like really 3 years of the project. And also the weirdness of that was that it coincided with a pandemic. It was a weird time, it was a strange time. So the low time for me probably came when the initial push of needing to be so forceful and energized and sort of fierce about what we were doing, when actually the hardest work was done. That was a weird energetic change for me. And yeah, and so it's a great question. It's something maybe I should reflect on more so I'm better prepared to answer it the next time. The other question was about like sustaining myself in the midst of, yeah. So since it's been about a full year now that, because what we ended up choosing to do was partner with a nonprofit that was being birthed in the community around the same time that we were doing this work. We decided to release a lot of the day-to-day operations and the overall oversight of this housing project to that nonprofit. And in the last year, I was working, and this is ridiculous and no one should do it. But I mean, the reality is that probably for those 3 years, I was working 70, 80 hours a week, just nonstop. I mean, sometimes like 24 hours, right? Because I would be the person pulling the all-night shift. So for the last year, I've been able to turn back toward the congregation in a different kind of way, and pay attention to some other things. And what I notice now, I mean, the truthful answer is that I did nothing right or good for myself in those 3 years. But now, what I realize is that where my aliveness, where I come the most alive and I'm most clear about what is mine to do in the world and where I've been called, is when I go outside and I spend an hour in conversation with someone who's living across the driveway, or I take a walk through that tree farm and just, check in on folks. How are you doing today? Like, there is nothing, there's no massage, there's no therapy session, there's no nothing that replaces that moment of connection for me. It's so clarifying. And so like now I get to say that thing that was so hard It is now the work that restores me. I don't get to do it in the same way I used to do it, but it is deeply affirming, life affirming.
Yeah, again, some of those God moments. Yeah.
Mm.
There was a question put into chat, and I think you kind of tapped on it a little bit with the nonprofit work, that you kind of help release some of the efforts to them. And when we think about housing, we often think about wraparound services, those kind of things. Again, that social service model. How do you partner, or who is it that you have thought of as different partners in providing the solidarity movement work for those experiencing homelessness?
Yeah. So it's certainly not the way we started, but today because of the wide variety of social service organizations that came to the table, I mean, everyone wanted us to succeed. It was a real need in our community. And I think they were just so happy to see us risk something, and they wanted to help us be successful. So we partner with everyone from the local hospital, with local MDs, the therapy community, the spiritual direction community, the chaplaincy community, to the local food bank, and caseworkers and case management, housing support. And we partner with all of them, which is amazing. We recognized within a year, right? We can't do this by ourselves. We're not experts in this. This is like not our jam. We do know how to love people and how to see their inherent worth and value, but the rest of this is like, we're not professionals. So we recognized we had to get out of it in order to provide all of the health, the safety, the stability, the things that we wanted to do. We knew that we needed partners who really knew what they were doing.
Yeah, that's awesome. We have one final chat question that came in, questions. And I really appreciate the activity we've seen on chat and the Q&A. So thank you to our participants for that. Please speak about how you navigate the accountability of the people you minister to. Are there hopes or processes to help them to restoration or transformation, and what does that entail? They asked this question because these are the questions they are asking their own church, and wanted to send a thank you, gratitude, and God bless you for the work that you've done.
I'm going to answer that the same way I answered that for people who are housed and in my congregation and come into my office saying they want to have a pastoral conversation where maybe they are seeking restoration in some area of their life, or they might use words like accountability or support. I'm not the expert at anyone's life. I'm not the expert. I don't even know what the right thing is. I can listen deeply and maybe, if we're lucky, help my congregants hear their own internal wisdom, goals, knowing, next right step. But I never know what it is. I never know what it is for someone else. That's the same way I think of the folks that I am in service to outdoors. I don't know what the next right step is. I don't know what restoration looks like. Only they know that for themselves. And if I'm lucky, I will get to companion them through a journey where maybe tomorrow they'll land on what that looks like. And maybe for some it is sobriety. Maybe for others it's taking care of some warrants. Maybe for others it's getting their kids back or getting housed. But it looks different for everyone. And it is never my job to say that here's what it looks like and here's what you need to do. My only job is showing up and being willing to accompany that individual however their path goes. And sometimes that looks like death. Sometimes it looks like an overdose. Sometimes it looks like never going back inside. And I just have to believe, and I do believe it so fiercely, that I don't get to write the end of the story. And I don't get to write what success or restoration looks like. My only job is to show up as present as I can, and to hope that that's a gift that's being a mutuality that will be exchanged.
Yes, 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 yes. I invite everybody just to kind of settle in before we close out here. I'm going to give a little explanation of what's ahead. and then we'll turn it over for a benediction. But I invite you to just be present where you're at. Breathing, paying attention to where in your body you are holding all of the information that we've heard today. And I invite you, even in this virtual space, to exhale that love into the world. And gratitude to you, Reverend Jen, for being with us today, for working so hard through the pandemic, for participating in this fellowship, for believing in the humanity and the dignity of all God's people. And for episode 4, the Southeast Conference, many of you have the best intentions. In fact, many of us have the best intentions to do the justice work that Christ shows us in the Gospels. All while we heard managing the realities of life that are continually happening. And so how do we continue to do the work of organizing or to help congregations get started in justice work when the day in and the day out life of the church, again with those air quotes, gets in the way? Join us next week for a conversation between myself and Reverend Heather Fosber of the Southeast Conference on how we keep trying to stay the course when plans go sideways or fail. And so, Reverend Jen, I turn it over to you. Thank you. So much gratitude for the work that you do, for the love that you give us. And please take us forth into the world.
Thank you, Ellie. This is what I say to my congregation every Sunday. I hope that it resonates inside and outside the walls of the sanctuary. I tell my folks that I hope that in this time you feel like you have been seen, that you have been blessed by another human who risks presence and companionship with you, and that you have been reminded of your birthright, the thing that is yours, part of your identity. That's your belovedness. No one can take it away from you, and there's nothing you did to earn it, and nothing can make it go away. So friends, today may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the face of God be turned towards you, and may the countenance of the Holy One look upon you with compassion and tenderness this day and forever. Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.